Hello and welcome to this webinar where we're going to discuss Canadian forest policy and supply risk, history and outlook. And as usual, this webinar is brought to you by Timber Exchange, your partner in tracking how the global timber markets are performing, but also automating your exports and customer service. And this week's guest is IFS' very own Mr. Rob Schuetz. Now, without further ado, a warm welcome to today's guest, Mr. Rob Schuetz. Hello, Mr. Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. A sincere pleasure
Hello,
having
Amir.
you, sir.
Thank you, Amir. Nice to meet you. It's interesting forum here, so I really appreciate the invitation, and hopefully you guys find some interest in what my story here that I have to share with you.
Yes.
What I'll do maybe is I was going to maybe share my screen if that works for you. So and I got a PowerPoint here, which is a few slides, and I'll go through that, and then I think that'll probably take about 20 to 30 minutes, and then and you probably have some questions after the fact. So here,
Absolutely. The floor is yours. You have a very interesting story to tell.
all right. You can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So Canadian forest policy and supply risk, and just a little bit of a history and an outlook. Again, thanks, Amir, for the invitation. So just a quick introduction to myself. So our company, Industrial Forestry Service, was established in 1952 in the central British Columbia. I was back in a time when there was probably about 600 sawmills operating within a small geographic area in the central part of British Columbia. Since that time, there's a lot fewer sawmills in that area. I think we're down in at least in Prince George area where I'm from, and where our company's primarily established. We're probably down to only half a dozen. Our company is about 110 full-time employees that mostly focus on the pre-harvest work. So there's probably about 50, 60 that do the cut block layout, road location, bridge inspections and bridge designs and that kind of thing. And we also have a forest seedling nursery that we grow about 20 million seedlings per year. So a lot of the with the nursery, it's right in near Prince George, and so there's about 111 greenhouses where we're producing seedlings just for the forest industry, and that's just for reforestation and mainly for industrial and government clients. We have a little bit of forestry software that we sell to mainly to the forest industry in British Columbia, just with respect to stumpage calculations and timber cruising and timber compilations. So I've been with Industrial Forestry Service since 1988, not 1952. I'm not quite that old, but since 88, and I've been the president here since 2010. And then my specialization really within the company for the last 30 some years has been primarily timber supply analysis, and then more recently a lot more due diligence analysis, either on pulp mill acquisitions or sawmill acquisitions, and the last 10 years a lot more into bioenergy, whether it's pellets or biomass to electricity. So that's kind of quite a big, broad overview of what we're about. So with respect to Canada, the map here below shows you, Canada with the different provinces, and each of those numbers in the provinces reflect the amount of lumber production that was created in softwood lumber in 2023. So as you can see from that map, on the west coast, which is where I'm located, where they got 16.2 million cubic meters of lumber is British Columbia. The central part of the province or of the country is 0.5 to 0.6. It's a lot more open prairies, that kind of thing. And then on the east, you have the Maritimes, and at Quebec is where it's 12.3. So The majority of, well, at least historically, about half of the production from Canada was coming from British Columbia. And as you can see from those numbers, that's not quite the case anymore. It's not quite half from British Columbia. For those of you who don't know, Canada is predominantly public lands, or what we call crown lands. So 90% of Canada is public. And therefore, the management of the lands is controlled by the provinces, and the federal government just has jurisdiction over certain aspects, but majority is provincial jurisdiction, and consequently, all of the management of the lands rests with the provinces. So as you can see in the bottom left, softwood lumber production has been declining, even though we had a couple of decent years after the the 2010 housing crash in the U.S. We had a little bit of a rebound, and but the trend, even in respect to the high lumber prices that occurred in 21, 22, has been going down. And so this is more of a story of why some of those things have been happening. The main thing I was going to talk about just is three primary factors of concern with respect to fiber, or access to fiber in Canada. And number one is wildfire. That's in the news quite a bit. Number two is wildlife protection. So we'll touch a little bit on that. And then number three is Indigenous reconciliation. And that'll be probably the majority of the discussion, because it's more topical and quite interesting. As you can see on the right, the Canada lumber production again is going down over the last since 2014. But with respect to the reduction, most of that reduction is in British Columbia. You can see by that the blue dashed line, lumber production in the rest of Canada is fairly flat. Between around 35 million cubic meters of lumber per year, whereas British Columbia has declined from about 32 million to under 20 million. So talking about wildfire first, the media impact versus the forestry impact. So the wildfire, just recently, we in British Columbia, or actually in Alberta, they lost what's it called, the small town, or as a resort town of Jasper. About a half, or approximately half of Jasper burnt down simply because of the huge volume of dead pine that was in that area. In previous years, like last year in 2023, as that picture shows in the middle, huge wildfire across, right in central British Columbia, where that picture was right across the lake from the community, or the city of Kelowna. And then, as you can see at the top right, there's the Statue of Liberty, where a lot of the Americans were concerned about the wildfires in Canada, and all of the smoke that was created in 2003. And then, the media also, when you create those maps in the bottom left, it shows, these huge circles where all the fires are, and it gives you the impression that Canada is burning, and there's not going to be any wood left. Some quick statistics go on. So the map there again shows where the fires happened over the last 5-6 years. So since 2017 to 2023. 2017 and 2018 were really large years for fires in British Columbia. 23 again. The green area really is the total forest in Canada. Up in the north, it's tundra, and you can see in the central bottom, it's grasslands and prairies. But 367 million hectares of forest, and of that, productive forest is about 219 million. But when you do the math and you see, okay, how much was burned between 2017 and 2023, it was about 29 million, or 14% of our forests had burned. The bigger question, though, is how much is it going to affect the sawmills? And when we look at, okay, from a straight line perspective, where the existing sawmills are in Canada, which are those blue dots on the screen, It's only about 5% of the, that area where the fires happened. And when you reduce the commercial or the productive forest land base to say, well, they draw a circle on a map and say that that circle is the wildfire, but only about half or less than half is actually a commercial forest that might be accessible by the forest industry. And so when you adjust for the type and the quality and the distance and and just all the other impediments to getting access to fiber, the wildfire statistics for Canada isn't that severe. Yeah, you might have lost a couple sawmills, or a couple sawmills might have been shut down in some certain forest management areas. There might have been a dramatic impact, but across Canada, just generally, it's going to be less than 1%. So more of a, I guess, downplaying the impact of wildfire on Canada. The other thing is it resets the age of a lot of stands, but it's not really going to have a long-term negative impact on the lumber production and timber supply for the country. The bigger question is wildlife protection. So, like I said earlier, the provinces are responsible for the the management of the resources, but the federal government is responsible for Species at Risk Act and provides legal protection for to prevent wildlife from extinction. And there's two predominant wildlife that are closely related to how access to fiber really, and those are really in woodland caribou and boreal caribou. And the intent, by in the last few years, with respect to the Species at Risk Act and the pressures to preserve caribou habitat, is that they want to have about 65% of the habitat area undisturbed. So a lot of the, and the forest industry has been aware of these kind of concerns for quite a long time. They've been in some certain areas trying to establish different plans to address declining habitat number or declining population numbers. However, sometimes that's not enough. And so, even recently, the news releases just this past year is, for the Quebec government's failure to accommodate caribou habitat, and the federal government is now stepping in and instituting potentially kind of draconian measures to preserve habitat. And some of those measures are going to have a significant negative impact on timber supply and forestry in northern Quebec. The same thing with British Columbia. There's at least one sawmill in the northeast part of the province that has closed in the last 2 years, simply because of caribou habitat protection. There's a lot of times those sawmills will shut down before the actual policies or parks are created. And so you can see down below on the right, 2024, they established 2,000 square kilometers of park in northeastern British Columbia. But about 2 years before that, the sawmill in that area closed simply because they could, the writing was on the wall for that. And that is, sort of a concern. But when you look at the entire country, and the caribou habitat in it, the purple cross-hatched lines on Canada is caribou habitat. Again, where does it exist with respect to the sawmills? The sawmills again are the blue dots. Within 150 kilometers of the existing sawmills, there's probably a 20% impact on the with respect to the productive forest area that could be impacted. And you can see where a lot of those sawmills are overlapping with caribou habitat, both especially in British Columbia, but also in northern Alberta and on the eastern coast. Some of those sawmills are right in the midst of the caribou habitat. And when you're looking at 65% undisturbed habitat, that's potentially going to be a large negative impact on the ability to access fiber for some of those sawmills. So yeah, continuing on, Indigenous reconciliation. Before I go into this, a little bit of a history. So in Canada, we had treaties signed with First Nations, mostly, in the 1800s. However, there were no treaties that were signed west of the Rocky Mountains, and that's predominantly British Columbia. There's in northeastern British Columbia, there was one big treaty signed, but west of the Rocky Mountains, there was, I think, maybe one small one on Vancouver Island, but otherwise the government kind of let that opportunity or that policy slide for over 100 years. So then and that's not taking into consideration that over that period of time, the First Nations in British Columbia, had a lot of or took a lot of time and effort to try to install or negotiate with the government, but for the most part, nothing happened for almost a century. In 1982, Canada, brought the Constitution, basically to Canada from the UK, and in that Constitution, they recognized Aboriginal rights and title. And so once that happened, then between the First Nations started going to court again with the province of British Columbia, and between 1991 and 2020, a number of key challenges by First Nations about rights and title were made in the courts, and of course, British Columbia the government loses those cases, and so there's more and more pressure on the government, to accommodate First Nations. In 2019, the government of British Columbia adopts principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and so that was again probably a consequence of all of those court cases that established that they still had rights and title to the forest and to the ground where they live. And so, when that happened with the new government that came into power in 2017, then after that, the government started introducing a lot more policies with respect to forest and land management that we're really changing the framework under which everybody operates, not just forestry, but mining, oil and gas, electricity, all of that stuff. And so and all of those policies of for forest land and forest management were all in the spirit of Indigenous reconciliation. Basically, they want to adopt the principles of the UN Declaration and incorporate the Indigenous people into ownership and management of the land. So what impact does that have? This chart here really shows, this is primarily, like I said, it was British Columbia that didn't have any of these treaties. So in the 1990s, actually that blue line at the top is the forecast annual allowable cut, which is the culmination of hundreds of different forest management units that aggregated together provide the maximum amount of volume that you're allowed to harvest per year in cubic meters. And so in the 1990s to about 1998, there was, the harvest was really close to that annual allowable cut, probably 95%. And the policies and the management of the land, like I said, was with respect to the provincial government were the managers, but the forest industry was able to operate largely unconstrained as long as they stayed below the annual level cut. Then around the late 1998, we had the mountain pine beetle epidemic that really killed or started to kill all of the standing lodgepole pine in the province. And there was probably about, say, 50% of our growing stock at that time was lodgepole pine. The other two predominant species in British Columbia, at least in the interior, are white spruce, Engelmann spruce, and balsam fir. So for about 12, 13 years, the mountain pine beetle was increasing in population. It was killing the dead pine, or killing the pine trees. So the government increased the annual allowable cut to facilitate the salvage and harvest of those trees. However, everybody knew that that was kind of a short-lived measure, because what comes up must come down. And so the forest industry did harvest a little bit more for a few years, but then you had the 2008 housing crash in the United States. And so the harvest plummeted in British Columbia. And ultimately, in that kind of era, we only harvested about 80% of the annual allowable cut. When 2010 comes along, well, you could see that by then, probably all of the dead trees, and I think we lost probably about 57% of our mature merchantable growing stock with respect to the dead pine. The harvest levels start coming down, but you can see the actual harvest never went back up. It was dead pine that had minimal value with respect to lumber production. It was degraded and it was falling down. And so you had a lot of inventory with respect to dead pine that was available for the pulp and paper industry, but you didn't, the forest industry, recovering after the housing crash, a lot of sawmills had shut down. So the harvest never really came back up to the annual allowable cut, simply because the sawmills knew that eventually it was going to continue to decline. And our forecast back then was that by 2024, 25, we should be at a normal state. However, like I said, about 2019, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, was accepted by British Columbia, and with it a whole bunch of policy changes. And so in the last few years, even though 2021, 2022, the lumber prices were fantastic with respect to producers in British Columbia and across North America, we weren't able to respond. Our harvest in those 4 years at the start of 2020 was only about 47% of the annual allowable cut. And remember, most of that dead pine now has been either it's blown over, it's burnt, it's unsalvageable, and the harvests are going to continue to decline a little bit for that. But now we have a shift by the government for conservation and reconciliation. So what does that mean? So our policy changes in the government. It's what that means is it's the shared decision making. So where before the government was responsible for 90% of the decisions in the province, now the First Nations have a say. They've got old growth forest, and to accommodate a lot more of the NGOs that the government is trying to appease, at least the provincial government. They're trying to protect more old growth forest because, I guess the studies carried out in British Columbia indicate that was a priority. Government wants to incorporate First Nations into forest management, so they're awarding more tenures to for the First Nations. But everything's already allocated, so by awarding more tenures, they're taking away from Peter to give to Paul. So the forest companies or the sawmills that had the forest tenure that provide fiber security, the government is taking that away from them and giving it to First Nations, with the intent of getting them up to about 20% of the harvesting would come from their tenures. Other policy changes, the intent is 30. I think it's across North America, or at least a number of countries is 30% parks by 2030. Now I think, depending on what you consider parks, we're probably close to that already. So not too much of a negative impact from a timber supply perspective. Government's also a whole bunch of funding initiatives with respect to, and most of that 300 million that I've identified is directed to First Nations to identify parks and facilitate, how they're going to manage the land base. Tripartite framework, that's really what that means is three governments. The First Nations on one hand, the federal government on another, and the provincial government another. A framework agreement to try to determine how they're going to manage areas. Forest landscape plans are a new initiative of the governments. They're basically, a whole bunch of people are going to be sitting at the table now and determining where you can harvest, how you're going to harvest, what the riparian reserves are, how much old growth you need. Is the public and the First Nations comfortable with the way things have been going? And for the most part, they probably haven't been. So that'll be a mechanism whereby it'll be formalized and incorporate all of these other things that are, all these other policies that are being incorporated. And then you got a forest carbon offset protocol. I'll talk a little bit about that more at the end, but there's an initiative by a lot of First Nations especially to not harvest, but instead leave the forest standing and collect money as carbon offset. Land Act amendments and ecosystem-based management and the environmental stewardship initiatives, those are all kind of new changes, policy, and just effectively means that there's more pressures on the land base and reducing access to fiber. Indigenous transfer payments. So with all of this happening, the government recognized that the First Nations have to be part of it's their land. They have to be part of the decision-making process, but they didn't want to they didn't want to stop harvesting altogether, or the logging trucks. They didn't want them to stop running, and so the intent with these Indigenous transfer payments is that they're effectively trying to get it so that a portion of the stumpage collected by the provinces for logging on public lands, a portion of that would go to the Indigenous peoples whose land that harvesting was happening on. And there's a problem with that, though. And this next slide here is kind of explains why we're only at about 47% of the annual allowable cut. So what the government has done, and actually what the First Nations have done across BC, and in the background you see, a portion of British Columbia, and you see these numbers on it. Well, the problem with treaties in British Columbia in the recent past has simply been, where do those First Nations, where's their land? Right now, you have in any one specific area, you can have anywhere from 2 to 9 different nations, different bands saying that, hey, this is our territory, and another guy's saying this is our territory. So how do you prove who has what, and where is their boundaries? And so if you're going to harvest in any one of these areas, you have to get consent now from not just one First Nation, but 2 or 3 or 4. And across British Columbia, there's 203 different First Nations bands. So effectively, where before we had one government that we're dealing with, we're now dealing with provincially, 204 different governments, including the provincial government. So if you're wondering why the harvest is only 47% of the annual allowable cut, it's because these requests for consent is problematic, in the short term here. Too many pieces, or too many individuals want a piece of the pie, and you have to get consensus from all of them to accommodate and to approve a cutting permit. The other thing is because all of this has happened, all these policies have been incorporated for First Nations over the last few years, and a lot of these bans are only maybe anywhere from 300 individuals to 1,000. They lack the capacity to respond. So you get, they're inundated with requests for decisions on cutting permits from the forest industry, from the oil and gas industry, from the mining industry. And so how do you respond to that effectively? And so that's where a lot of the government funding is coming to First Nations to accommodate that. But it takes time to get their governance structure in place. Like I said, there's overlapping territories and multiple parties to consult. And so what the government or what the forest industries are experiencing is huge difficulty acquiring cutting permits. And and in the background of all that, they recognize, well, we got all of this happening with First Nations, plus they've got the old growth areas that they want to protect, and they've got new caribou areas and new parks that they want to create. So if certain areas of British Columbia haven't been accessed yet, or there's a valley that's supposedly contributing to the timber harvesting or land base and to the annual allowable cut, the question that a lot of the companies are asking is, why would we build a road into a new area when the cutting permit is in question? And so consequently, 47% of the annual allowable cut is it's really a huge level of uncertainty on the future of their ability to operate and whether or not they will continue to operate. More reasons why. Like I said, some of the Indigenous bands with forest tenure, actually in British Columbia, they've been awarded tenure, and the First Nations decide, no, we're not going to harvest, we're going to convert it to parks. You've got 203 different bands, each with a different level of economic motivation. Some of them want to be engaged in the forest industry, some of them don't. Since 2017, huge amount of transfer payments have been made to the first Indigenous groups in British Columbia. You can see that all through the, in Canada, they have a Transparency Act, so they have to report their income statements online, and all you have to do is look at those income statements and see that a lot of their surplus funds have gone, from 2017 from maybe $1 million to hundreds of millions. So they're quickly becoming wealthy, and at the same time, if they're wealthy, why do they need the stumpage payments? And so again, why bother with approving cutting permits? Just a comment, because I've been getting involved a lot more in carbon offsets and carbon offset payments, but the fallacy with that, at least in British Columbia, is, as you can see on the chart on the right, this is the coast region, and you have an annual allowable cut of about 22 million, but the harvest, even before any of this First Nations things happened, the harvest was only around 15 or 14 million. So, under the BC protocol, basically they're selling an illusion whereby they're saying, well, we'll reduce our AAC, we'll get our transfer payment, and but it won't really have an impact on the harvest. So again, just a smoke and mirrors kind of thing that's happening in British Columbia. So as a result of, or the consequences of all of this is really, the lack of reinvestment in forestry in British Columbia. 25 sawmill closures since 2019. We've been pulp and paper closures. If the sawmills aren't there, the pulp and paper industry doesn't have the chip supply they need. So we've had 6, if not mill closures, then at least the digesters of the lines, and 20,000 plus jobs since 2019. So, shared obligations, they don't exist. The way we're approaching management in British Columbia, these shared obligations probably don't exist in too many other jurisdictions, and consequently, a lot of uncertainty, and also a huge increase in our log costs. So, when you see, again, when I come back to that chart on the right, where you see that the harvest for the rest of Canada is still at around 35 million cubic meters of softwood lumber production, British Columbia is still decreasing, and the forecast, for British Columbia in the future is we don't really see an uptick. Even if lumber prices went back to $600, $700 per thousand, you might be able to get a small increase, but for the most part, the annual allowable cut will continue to decline, and there will not be a recovery here. Having said that, though, for the people that do survive, and can operate effectively with First Nations, and they've established themselves. We forecast we'll have more sawmill closures, but the ones that survive will be in a very nice position because demand for lumber will continue to go up, and there'll be tremendous opportunity for those mills that are left operating. In the background behind this, the politicians are advocating value-added manufacturing, but the fallacy again with, well, you can only have a value-added industry if you have a strong primary industry. So it's kind of value-added is probably what they're advocating, simply because they have nothing else or nothing good to say about the industry. And so while they blame lumber prices for the mill closures, it's really the policies that we've introduced over the last few years that are formulating these changes, and not just the policies over the last few years, but recognition of all of the mistakes, I guess, the government has carried out with First Nations and with Indigenous in British Columbia since the 1800s. So that concludes my presentation. I'm sure there's probably a few questions. Amir, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rob. That was extremely interesting. It was particularly interesting to see how you merged all of these different areas about rights, policies, and history, and weave it together into a very compelling story and how it actually affects us today. And it's very clear, actually, that this is going to affect the global market, because Canada is a major producer. It's the biggest exporter to the US. And if Canada plays a smaller role in the US, it will affect the rest of the global market in just a few years' time, and certainly by end of the decade. So to the audience, down below, there's a button called Q&A. Please submit your questions there, and I'll be asking your questions to Mr. Rob Schuetz. Until we get a few questions, let's look at what is happening in Canada. Some of the things that we track, for example, in Canada is the production. And we can see, similar as what Mr. Rob mentioned, is that production is on the way down. On a year-on-year basis, it's actually up, but over a 6-month period, it's slightly down. The stock of lumber in Canada is increasing. This is not the latest updated data. There is more recent data, but it has been rising since July 23 until slightly before summer. The prices of logs in Canada have been going up pretty significantly, actually. On a 6-month period, they've increased 14%, and on a 3-month period, 19% even. Whilst the volume of purchased logs by the industry is on a slightly downward trend as well, and is reaching summer lows as usual, as we can see every year. But the shipment volume of Canadian lumber seems to be pretty stable, comparing with post-COVID, but of course, compared to pre-COVID, it is slightly lower. And yes, let's see what questions we have received in the Q&A. I see that Mr. Marcus is raising his hand. Please, Marcus, submit your question down in the Q&A section. Thank you, Marcus. The first question is from Mr. Ivar. Good to see you, Ivar. Thank you. Very interesting to see the perspective of what has been development in BC. That was not a question, but a comment. So the next comment or question is from Mr. Jeff. What's the effect of softwood lumber tariffs from the USA on Canadian lumber and forest management? Is this something that you can chime in on, Rob?
Well, sure. the effect of the tariffs is puts a constraint on, British Columbia. Actually, British Columbia is probably the highest cost producer because of all of these policy changes. And then when you add the tariffs, and it's supposed to be going up already to 14%, it's just another, I guess, nail in the coffin with respect to profitability in the short term. So, the tariff comes on, adds, I think it was jumping from 8% to 14%. It'll be a negative impact until such time that the lumber prices adjust to that, because there's going to be a ripple effect on if British Columbia curtails a bit more, and a lot of those curtailments are happening not just in British Columbia but on the U.S. South recently, and so yeah, it's a negative impact. And that'll only be reconciled with reductions in supply, which are inevitable.
The next question is from Ivar. Is there any serious investment going to happen regardless of the pessimistic situation in Canada? And are mills investing in either efficiency, and if so, to what extent? No serious investment. Bottom line is, I haven't heard of any mills, other than maybe there's no major investments really. It's really I think most of the pulp and paper industry is contracting in British Columbia. There's a lot of uncertainty on their future. If they can't get the chips, and so then it's really the sawmills. Same thing. Can they, if the mill can identify a solid First Nations partner or partners to facilitate their future, then there might be an opportunity to increase and to reinvest. But for the most part, we don't see that, and we haven't seen, even I know first or forest companies that have reached out to First Nations to try to facilitate partnerships. A lot of these, I guess the problem is that the capital required for a partnership might exceed what the First Nations have traditionally had, or even would have considered. And do they want to get into an industry, when they give the perspective that they're all about conservation? And so for the post, so there's a lot of, again, it comes back to this period of uncertainty with respect to fiber supply and access to fiber, and without that, there's not going to be any investment. A little bit's been happening with value added, because if you're not shipping lumber to the U.S., you might be able to do mass timbers, but that's a very tiny component of the provincial forest industry. One question that comes to mind: are there any sawmills that are owned partly or wholly by First Nations?
A few of them are owned with small percentages. I know Hampton has, I think I'm guessing it's about 3%. There was a sawmill that was closed recently right on the coast that First Nations have acquired, but it's not running right now. So that we'll be interested to see whether it restarts. But it's also in a very high cost area. In the interior, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. Nothing substantial.
But hypothetically, if a First Nation had a sawmill on their own land, they wouldn't have to cut through all this red tape.
That's correct. Yeah. But so far, there's a few nations that have significant, getting close to 1 million cubic meters of harvesting rights, and even those ones, when I've talked to them, they're not interested in the sawmilling aspect. They're interestingly, they're kind of delusional in that they think, well, no, we'll just be a lumber broker. Their history is all just about harvesting and delivery of logs. But it's like, well, if you're not going to invest soon, you're not going to have any customers in certain areas. So you would think that eventually the light would come on in their heads to say, hey, we need to get integrated, but that hasn't happened yet.
Very, very interesting.
And they might lose those opportunities before they figure it out.
Mm-hmm. And by the time they figure it out, it might be too late.
Yeah.
We have a question from Michael. Good to see you, Michael. In BC, you forecast more land will not be managed. The results will be more forests will age out. Is there any concern from political leaders in BC that the results will be even more forest fires, leading to increased evacuations and loss of property and more carbon emissions?
I agree 100% with that comment. And the answer is, I don't think the government cares about, they're in the illusion that old forests are good forests. They see on the coast these massive trees that are 200 years old and that are like a park underneath it, and they think that's what all forests should look like. And so the politicians, that the focus for them is simply old growth, and the public, they're responding to public pressures because they're not really educated and thinking, well, old growth is good for us. Not realizing that, yeah, those forest fires are going to grow, and insect epidemics will expand again simply because of lack of management. They think lack of management is good, yeah. So again, a good question, and I don't think that the government has figured that out yet.
The next question is from Dustin. You mentioned on this essentially, but maybe you have something to add. Rob, what are your thoughts on the viability of continued investment in your business and other businesses that depend on and support this industry?
So I wrestle with that question all the time, simply because we grow 200 million seedlings per year in greenhouses, and so it's tied directly to the forest industry. So far, we have the seedling industry hasn't been too negatively impacted, but we can see that the writing's on the wall. So there's minimal opportunity to invest until we see better direction by First Nations on how they want to manage the forests collaboratively with not just the two other governments, federal and provincial, but also with industry. Barring that, there's what we're looking at is converting some of our greenhouses to food production and improve food security, because if there's not going to be seedling demand, then what do you do with that? So yeah, more of an exit on investment in forestry, and looking at opportunities for elsewhere.
The next question is from Christina. Hi, Christina. Good to see you again. How important is the forestry industry to the economy of BC? Is it major, minor? Because it seems odd that there would be no action taken. There's no actions to take to profit from a healthy forest industry.
I don't have the percentages, but nationally, I think I'd seen something. It was about 1%, but in British Columbia, forestry, like north of Vancouver is the predominant city in British Columbia. The majority of the people that live there, they're not really integrated into the forest economy. As you go further north to every other community, some of the communities are heavily dependent, and so as we forecast these mill closures, and over the last 20 years, we've probably had over 40 mills close in the interior. It's a direct correlation, and GDP with forestry, I would guess it's probably 5%, maybe a little higher, and forecast to decline significantly. And so I'm not sure. I know when what's it called? Royal Bank of Canada produced some projections and numbers with respect to the provincial economies and their profitability. It did not look good for the future for investment in this province.
And the final question from the audience today is, do you anticipate similar policies being applied in other parts of Canada?
Good question, because so very recently there was a decision. Remember, I said at the start that there was the northeast corner of British Columbia had one treaty. It was a Treaty 8, and it was similar to all the other treaties across Canada. And in that treaty, the First Nations made a claim against the province that effectively said you broke the terms of the treaty, and through multiple effects of different industries, I don't know all the legal jargon, but you impacted negatively on the treaty, and consequently, there's a settlement agreement of hundreds of millions of dollars. The government of BC didn't appeal. They just rolled over and said, okay, in the spirit of reconciliation, you're right. We'll make this right. That treaty also extends into the province of Alberta, where they're a little bit maybe more economically focused, the government, and so there's a claim going on there now, and there's other claims in Ontario as well, where rights and title have been questioned, and the performance of government in terms of how they address the different aspects of those treaties are being questioned, and in some cases, in the courts, the First Nations are winning, and so we see a slow change in the other parts of the country, not quite as fast as in British Columbia, but there is risk that there'll be cumulative effects, kind of occurrences in the other provinces as well. Now, in the Maritimes, there was another challenge very recently that they lost. The First Nations were claiming, I think half of the province of New Brunswick, and at the same time, the lawyers were saying, well, no, we're just after the crown lands, we're not after the public ones, and when I read that, I said, yeah, yet. You're not after it yet, but maybe in the future. So in that case, they lost as well. So it'll be a lot of uncertainty with respect to investment in a lot of jurisdictions as different nations stretch their the limits of what they might be able to accommodate in the legal forum.
I have a question, actually. You've shown that there is so much to take into consideration when taking basically any decision these days. So how long how much longer is the decision-making cycle today than it was maybe a decade ago? Or even maybe longer?
Yeah, there's a whole there's a lot of work that has to be done before you're allowed to harvest in British Columbia. And typically, historically, you go back 10 years, from the point when you can draw a line or a circle on a map or a polygon, say we want to harvest that area, to when you actually get a cutting permit and are able to get the loggers out there, it was about a 6 to 8 month process. Now that process is close to 2 years. Simply because there's all these new features. There's going to be these, the intent though. So right now it's about 2 years. The intent is that by government that these forest landscape plans will streamline that and maybe provide more certainty that the cut blocks will be in a location that everybody agrees to, and so more consensus. So what we kind of see is that it's kind of like a bell curve where, yeah, we're in the midst of the worst of it right now. Once those landscape plans are in place, and you're going to have a considerably smaller timber harvesting land base and a smaller forest industry, but the remaining areas that they can harvest, it'll probably be streamlined and they'll be able to respond quickly. So it comes back to, if you can survive this period of uncertainty and the turmoil that's created as a result of the various policies that governments introduced, if you can survive that, then you'll be in a really good position in the future.
One question on policy and the government. Is there any chance for the government itself to step in and save the industry? Do they have the mandate and the legislative permission if they want and need to, or is it a dead end?
No, so there was a couple things that just happened in the last week. So the government is responsible once they've set an annual elbow cut to apportion the harvest. And in one forest management unit, it really surprised me recently because the forest minister did not give as much tenure to First Nations as everyone expected. Simply because I think even the government foresters were surprised by this, and it was a decision by the minister recognizing that if he did what everybody was advocating, that the remaining forest industry in that area would shut down. And so it's slowly the light's coming on. It seems like in respect to a few government officials or government ministers. The other thing that was a recent good news story was in the past, these when they had these cutting permits, it seemed like they would only be approved if all the First Nations agreed. And so, like I said earlier, you might have overlaps with 3 or 4 nations, and you had to get all the approval of all of them. And so now, finally, it seems like some of the government bureaucrats who are making the decision on the cutting permit approvals are getting frustrated with that process, whereby 3 of the 4 might be in favor of harvesting, and they're saying, well, instead of consensus between all 4 nations, it's majority rules, and so they might start going down this path to help the industry along.
And in that example, would they, for example, be harvesting the forest on the party that rejected?
That's correct. Yeah,
But
like I said, there's where is their land really? They're all claiming the same chunk of land because they all want a piece of the pie. They see that the revenue from a larger traditional territory means a better picture for their community. So they can't get a treaty in place. They can't sign a treaty with the government because they haven't proven that they actually own that or historically owned that chunk of land. And you've got in certain areas 3 or 4 or 5 other nations saying the same thing. So you can only sign a treaty if you have surety, and that's one of the big challenges. You have rights and title, but where? And so and lacking that, I think government's finally coming to the realization that consensus doesn't work, and maybe it's majority rules will win the day for the forest industry as well. So hopefully that message gets resonated in a few more decision makers within government.
Very, very interesting. We have a question from Stefano. Is there a new trend to export more sawn timber from BC to Europe? At least in my, I would need to check the data and ask around, but at least in my experience, it's a no. But what I do know is happening is export of lumber from Europe to the US, and also rough sawn lumber from Europe to Canada that is being value added in Canada. This is something I have seen myself. Rob, have you heard of anything on this topic?
No, I have not. The log exports are still occurring in British Columbia, primarily to China, but on the East Coast we haven't heard too much, and most of the provinces have policies in place to really limit the export of lumber or logs and maintain domestic lumber production in Canada.
We're going to try to get on the Canadian Forestry Minister. We like to aim high, and I want you to help me draft the questions if and when we manage to do that. That would be quite the conversation, I believe.
Huh.
And what you mentioned about the falling annual level cut from 70 million to 50 million, this is quite a significant chunk. And This will create a supply gap in the US, I'm pretty sure. And it means that Europe will play a larger role in North America, but Europe has its own issues as well, with war, with inflation, with cutting rights, especially, for example, I live here in Sweden, especially in North Sweden, and everything is very interconnected. So it's very important that we hear directly from people with insight. So it's been a sincere pleasure having you on, Mr. Rob. Thank you so much for coming on. We really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Amir, for having me. Appreciate the time to talk.
Our sincere pleasure. And if anybody has questions for Rob, respecting, of course, GDPR and privacy, please email your question. If you have any further questions to Rob, please email me and I'll be forwarding them over to him. To Mr. Rob, again, thank you so much for joining us and taking your time to share your knowledge and insights. And to the audience, thank you so much for listening again and coming back after summer holidays. We're going to try to do this every 2 weeks going forward. Thank you so much, everyone. And until next time, bye-bye.